Hi, everyone. It's 10 o'clock now, but because we've got quite a number of people who registered and have yet to turn up, so let's wait for about 5 more minutes before we start on the dot. All right, we shall start at 10:05 on the dot. Thank you very much for waiting. Lynette, is it possible to play the music while waiting? Thank you.
Education, more than just knowledge. It is a catalyst that transforms individuals and impacts generations. Here at the National Institute of Education, Singapore, we empower our students to become outstanding educators, to pursue skills mastery, and to deepen their professional competencies. NIE is ranked amongst the best educational institutions in the world and is a part of Nanyang Technological University, Singapore, one of Asia's top universities. That is why our programs and courses are not just for teachers, but also professionals from all walks of life. So whether you're a recent graduate searching for a higher degree or a working professional looking to improve yourself, we will expand your domain knowledge, develop your critical inquiry skills, and build your proficiencies in communication and leadership, giving you the wings to soar wherever you choose to go. Log on to our website to find out more about our programs and courses today.
Right, 10:05. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for our second ELL webinar. Without further ado, let me introduce the person who introduced the speakers and someone which we all are very familiar with, and that would be Dr. Willie Renandia. He is the principal lecturer at National Institute of Education, NTU, Singapore. Prior to his current position here with us, he taught at Simeo RELC Singapore, where he also served as the head department for language education and research. He has taught in many parts of Asia, which I'm sure we are all very familiar with in Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam. He's a frequent speaker at language conferences and webinars in the Asian region, especially these past 2 years. His teaching research interests include second foreign language pedagogy, extensive reading, language testing, and curriculum development. He has published extensively in journals, in regional journals, in international journals, chapters and books. And he has a very strong web presence via his Willie's ELT Corner, willierenandia.com, as well as the administrator at Teacher Voices Professional Development Facebook page. So if you're still not on the Teacher Voices Facebook page, do join the Facebook page membership. And without further ado, I will let Willie introduce the speakers for today. Willie.
Thank you very much, Jason. And good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so excited to see many familiar faces in the audience. And on behalf of my colleagues here at the English Language and Literature Department, I would like to thank you once again for making time to be with us this Saturday morning. You are currently attending the second session of the webinar series hosted by my department. And the first webinar, if you recall, was held in November last year and was very well received. The feedback was so encouraging, so we have decided to continue with the second session that you are attending today. Ladies and gentlemen, now that COVID-19 is almost gone, hopefully it's going to be, disappearing for good. I'd like to extend an invitation to all of you to come and visit us here in Singapore. And when you do, I will give you a tour of my university, free of charge, and also introduce you to our graduate programs. Very important. Our graduate programs, we've got an MA and PhD programs in applied linguistics, an MED and ED, Doctor in Education programs in English education. And we've got students from many different countries in the region, from China, from Indonesia, from Korea, from Singapore, Vietnam, and also other countries. Some are fee-paying students. Some are on our scholarship, a small number, and the rest are on the government's scholarship. Graduate students from Indonesia, for example, very important, those of you from Indonesia, are on the prestigious LPDP scholarship. And we have a number of students now from Indonesia who are studying with us on this very prestigious scholarship from the Indonesian government. We hope that you will consider coming to NIE for your graduate programs, maybe next year, if not the year after. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much again for joining us today. I hope you will enjoy the presentations by two of my esteemed colleagues, Dr. Donna Lim and Dr. Victor Lim. Same family names, but they are not related in that sense of the word. Both are very productive scholars and also very, very excellent teachers. Please enjoy the webinar today. Jason, back to you.
Thanks very much, Willie. Thanks very much, Willie, for that very inspiring introduction. I'm Dr. Robbie Lee Sabnani from NIE, and it's a pleasure to have you with us at our webinar today. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the webinar. He is Assistant Professor Victor Lim Fei. Let me tell you a little bit about Victor. Victor Lim is Assistant Professor at the National Institute of Education here at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He's very interested in how and what we should teach learners in today's digital age. He researches and teaches on multiliteracies, multimodal discourse analyses, and digital learning. And he's got a very exciting talk in store for us. So let me please join me in welcoming Assistant Professor Victor. Victor, over to you.
Thank you very much, Robbie, for the very kind introduction. Let me begin by sharing my screen. May I confirm that you are seeing the slideshow that I have for you?
Yep.
Great. Once again, thank you very much for the time to join us this Saturday morning for the webinar. My name is Victor, and I'm here to share with you a little bit of the work that I've done in the area of teaching multimodal literacy. And hopefully that would also encourage you to think about pursuing a postgraduate program here at NIE in Singapore. Now, my talk today will be fairly introductory in nature. So what I'm going to do is to share with you three different aspects of multimodal literacy. The first is in relation to what is multimodal literacy, helping us have a better sense of the definition of the term. The second is the big question of why should we as literacy educators think about teaching multimodal literacy. And the third where I talk about the practical strategies and ideas on how we can teach multimodal literacy in our classroom today, informed by a framework that I'm going to share with you. Is that okay? Now, I want to encourage you to make this session yours. So what it means is that if you have any questions, any feedback, please feel free to use the chat function, the Q&A function. And during the discussion session, we will return to the questions that you have. If we do not have time to answer your questions, you can follow up with an email to me and I'll give you my contact later on. All right, so I have about 40 minutes or so. So please sit back, relax, and think about the sharing that I have for you. The first question that I want to engage with in this session is the question of what is multimodal literacy. Now, I want to invite you to do this with me. Read the two words in your head. Does it sound different? Now, to many of us, the two words can sound rather differently in our head. And if you look at the interface, you'll find that the two words are exactly the same word, water. But the word on the right is expressed in a different font against a different background. And that is the difference in which multimodality can make. So while the words semantically are the same, but if you think about the role in which type font as well as the background, the visual, can play in adding layers of meaning to the word that we are from. Multimodality highlights that people draw on distinctly different sets of resources for meaning making. And this is not a totally new concept because ever since we started communicating with one another, we communicate not just with speech, but with gestures, with gaze, with space, positioning, proximity. However, multimodality has taken a stronger interest in recent years because of the advent of digital technology, where we realize that we are able to do more than expressing ourselves with just words, but with images, with videos, with music, easily at our disposal. Now, Günter Kress talks about how what we make available to the child is a central play with the toys that you have. And now think about a toy from Lego. They are also able to create buildings and structures in virtual worlds like Minecraft. So the resources that is the affordances of digital technology allows for new ways for children and our young people to express their ideas and their identities. And that makes multimodal literacy something that is a lot more important and relevant in today's digital age. Now, the term multi-literacies, and many of you may be familiar with that, was something that was introduced in 1996 by the New London Group in their manifesto. So essentially, the multi-literacies manifesto was a challenge to the dominant language focus in literacy education. The New London Group looked at the world of the day, and that was at the cusp of the 21st century, right? So globalization was happening. Digital technology, of course, was advancing. This was even before the internet and social media. And they say that, well, what does it mean for our children to remain literate in the world of tomorrow? What are some of the new ways of meaning making that we need to prepare our young people for as they engage in the so-called brave new world? So what they have done is to add two multis to literacies. The first multi is the multi of the enormous and significant differences in context and patterns of communication, recognizing that the students that you have in a classroom come from very different backgrounds and bring with them different experiences that we want to recognize in learning. And the second is the multi of multimodality, where we begin to recognize that new information and communication media has allowed for new ways of meaning making. So when we talk about multimodal literacy, we are engaging with the second aspect of multi-literacies, which focuses on multimodality. Carrie Jewett, a prominent scholar in the field, talks about the multimodal turn that has happened in the last 10 years. In fact, if you look at the literacy curriculum in many parts of the world, in countries such as Australia, Finland, Singapore, parts of the United States and the UK, there is that discernible shift towards expanding the literacy curriculum beyond just language learning to think about other knowledge and skills that's required and to include multiliteracies as part of the literacy curriculum. Fundamentally, this is about recognizing the many ways in which meanings are made, and there's therefore a need for us to build up the semiotic or meaning-making resources of students who are recognized as agentive meaning makers across contexts. So they operate in the school context, they go back home, in the social media space, in their gaming world, there's another context in which they operate and express meanings in. And all these are part of the literacy curriculum new requirements that we want to engage with. The term multimodal literacy was first proposed by Carrie Jewett and Günter Grass, which I've used their quotes earlier on, to represent the understanding and competencies across semiotic modes. And of course, they argue that information and knowledge are constructed in multimodal texts and discourses, which requires a multimodal literacy to fully assess their meanings. So this was their seminal book, edited book that was published in 2003. Now, over the years, we have begun to develop a clearer understanding of what multimodal literacy means. And for us, we see that there are aspects of knowledge and skills that are necessarily codified because when we talk about literacy, it's something that is expressed through the curriculum. There's an aspect of semiotic awareness, a sensitivity to the ways meanings are made. Maria Grazia Sindoni talks about multimodal orchestration, where there is that ability for the students or ourselves to be able to orchestrate and make meaning across the different modes. And of course, Theo van Loven highlights the importance of students being able to use and combine different semiotic modes in ways that are appropriate to a given context. So the ways in which knowledge is represented, for instance, in science, can be very different in the ways in which knowledge can be represented multimodally in, say, the humanities, history, or geography. And we want our students to be sensitive to that. Now, the other concept that I want to introduce fairly quickly for you today is the notion of pedagogy as design. And as teachers, we are designing learning experiences. Now, this was also based on the seminal work of the New London Group, the manifesto that I mentioned earlier on. And for them, they recognize that pedagogy is about designing the learning experiences of the students. And I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on that. Pedagogy from a social semiotic multimodal lens is the transposition of social relations from the social world around the school into the classroom as a metaphor of what kinds of social relations can be imagined and which the school might prefer. So everyone engaged in learning from the multimodal perspective, so both the teachers and the students are seen as designers of meaning because both are engaged in shaping the social interaction between them through communication. So what this means is, again, a challenge to what we are familiar with, the idea of the teacher as the knowledge authority or the sage on the stage. Well, in the digital age, again, you'll find that information is readily available to students at their fingertips. And the move and the shift and the role of the teacher is shifting from just being that knowledge authority to some say that they are facilitating the learning process as well. Now we take a step back and say that, well, as a designer of learning, there are occasions in the classroom in which the teacher will have to serve as a knowledge authority. And there are occasions or lesson stages in the classroom where the teacher has to play a more facilitative role. But really, if you take a step back and say that the teacher, as a designer of learning, what it means is that they have a heightened semiotic awareness and can orchestrate the embodied semiotic resources such as speech, gestures, positioning, and movement in the classroom, and to make good use of the semiotic technologies, both physical, like the whiteboard that you have, the textbooks that you have, and digital, the PowerPoint, the learning platforms that you may use in the design of the student learning experiences. So what this means is that as a designer, the teacher will reflect on their use of these material resources as well as the structures of power in a specific learning environment to best express their meanings. Now, this is something that I've elaborated in a book that you could, if you're interested, find out a little bit more. Essentially, the focus of the teacher as a designer of learning is where the teacher judges the best way in which the learner can best achieve the learning outcomes. And of course, it's mindful, as I mentioned, in the way they use technologies, tools, and resources with a clear awareness of what they can and cannot do. And this will be the lens that we put on as we think about how we want to teach multimodal literacy. Apart from the pedagogy of embodied teaching, what are some of the ways in which a teacher can design for multimodal literacy learning for the students in the digital age? Now, very quickly, I'm going to move on to the second aspect of the presentation today. And that is the big question that I've alluded to. Of why do we want to teach multimodal literacy? Isn't this something that is intuitive to our young people? Surely these are digital natives, and perhaps they're even more savvy with technology and multimodal meaning making than all of us. Well, the term digital natives were coined by Mark Prensky and refer, of course, to the millennial learners who have grown up with a host of relatively new technologies. And the digital natives, according to Mark, connects with friends and family through social networking, text messaging, and other technologically mediated approaches. And the idea of the digital native, the concept of the digital native, has influenced much of curriculum and teaching and learning. However, in more recent years, there's a recognition that this particular notion of the digital native has been challenged to be a myth. Rumberger, for instance, says that, well, even though the young people have grown up using digital technology, and maybe they're using digital technologies even for play, they may not be necessarily adept in the digital skills such as producing and interpreting visual communication or even using digital technology for learning. Other researchers have also noted that this notion of digital natives can be challenged because they are not homogeneous as a group. And many of them have a lot of individual differences and readiness to engage with multimodal meaning making, with digital technologies, because of the kind of background that they may come from. And so we know that we cannot assume, therefore, that the students are immediately intuitive in terms of using digital technology as well as in terms of multimodal meaning making. Now, from the policy perspective, some of you may be familiar with the On-Just Leisure and the OECD Program for International Student Assessment, or what we call as PITSA. And one of the findings that PITSA had in the earlier report is that 15-year-old students who have grown up with a computer may not necessarily possess the skills to navigate the digital environment. So when we talk about the digital divide, and of course, this is something that's pertinent in many countries, including Singapore, which was surfaced during the pandemic, it's about the access to devices, infrastructure. So access to hardware and computer is one form of digital divide. But what has been increasingly recognized is that there is the other digital divide, which is some has called digital divide 2.0. And essentially is the difference between people who have the literacies to effectively navigate the digital environment and those who are unable to do so. And as a result, we cannot assume then our young people who has grown up with computers will necessarily be savvy with multimodal meaning making, multimodal orchestration. Now, the colleague that I talked about, Maria Grazia Sindoni, has led an EU project that has completed recently to look at what is needed for young people to be able to engage with the new ways of meaning making afforded by digital technology. She calls this digital literacies, and she unpacks it into 4 dimensions. The first, of course, is something that we all think about when we think about digital literacies, and that is the use of digital technology, that proficiency or the fluency in terms of how to use technology. But there's more to digital literacies. There's also that dimension of multimodal orchestration that I've talked about, which refers to multimodal literacy. But apart from that, there are also other dimensions, such as the ability to engage in intercultural communication effectively, as well as transversal skills, critical thinking, communication skills, and the soft skills that many of us have taken for granted. And so multimodal literacy comes in as a little piece to fit in the puzzle of digital literacy, essentially recognizing the changing nature of the communicative landscape that we live in today, that and many of the new affordances that technology has brought about, requires therefore us to think about how we can broaden our definition of literacy beyond language learning to include multimodality. And of course, literacy in the new media age, as Gunter Kress points out, would involve human, cognitive, affective, cultural, and bodily engagement with the world and the forms and shapes of knowledge. And that requires for us to start thinking about a shift beyond an alphabetic literacy, a language-focused literacy, to new forms of literacies needed in today's world. And the way that I've unpacked it in the Singapore context for the English language curriculum is to think about what is needed for our young people to be considered literate in this day and age, where one aspect really is to be able to communicate effectively multimodally. And that requires our literacy curriculum to move beyond just the teaching and learning of reading in print to reading both in print and on screen. From that of reading of books to that of reading of books and viewing of multimodal text critically. From writing to writing and typing, from speaking to speaking and representing creatively. So it's not binary, it's not reading or viewing, it's not speaking or representing, but reading and viewing, speaking and representing, language learning and multimodal literacy that are both needed for us to think about the kind of literacy demands that our young people need to meet in today's new world. I hope you guys are okay, and I'm going to move on to my final part of today's presentation, where I would seek to give you some ideas of how we can then, as literacy educators, think about teaching multimodal literacies. Now, of course, some of the things that I talk about today may be beyond us in terms of the curriculum shifts that are needed to adopt a broadened notion of literacy learning to include multimodality, because that could be up to the school leaders or the administrators at the education ministry. But as teachers, as education researchers, we are able to effect very meaningful and very powerful changes in the classroom with our students as well. And what it means for us is to start thinking about how we can then design for multimodal literacy learning experiences for our students in the classroom. And for this, I'm going to base my sharing on a project that I have been doing in Singapore with secondary and primary schools called the Integrating Multiliteracies into the English Classroom project. So essentially, the focus of the project is to adopt a design-based research approach to understand how our teachers have been teaching multimodal literacy, what their perception of multiliteracies are, and also to get the students' experience and feedback on their learning of multiliteracies in the classroom. So that was the first focus in the project. And then in the subsequent phases, what we did was to co-design with the teachers lesson packages and to develop instructional approaches to teach multimodal literacy for students. So what are some ways in which we can effectively teach multimodal literacy? And of course, once the lesson packages were co-developed with the teachers, we had them trial it with other teachers in their school as well. So iteratively, they seek to improve the resources that we have. So I'm going to share with you fairly quickly what are some of the broad principles and ideas that you can think about when you want to teach multimodal literacy. And I believe that many of you are very experienced educators yourself, and you can think about how to apply these principles for the specific profile of students, as well as the specific needs of the classrooms that you are teaching. Are we okay? Okay. So what we have done is that we have worked with a number of teachers, and then of course we work with them in terms of co-designing the lesson packages, and we adopt the framework that was developed by Bill Cope and Mary Calantis on learning by design, and we then adapt it into a set of learning processes. I know this can be seen a little scary, but I'm going to unpack it for you. So we have a set of learning processes that we felt were important processes in the design of multimodal literacy learning. And I know this looks intimidating, but what you need to do is to think about the 4 words in the 4 quadrant, right? Encountering, expressing, evaluating, and exploring. And I'm going to share with you how these 4 learning processes can look like in the literacy classroom. Are you guys okay? So this is another way to represent it. And the first learning process that I want to focus on is encountering. And that is in relation to an effective engagement that we want to cultivate for our students. Now, you'll find that one of the things that we want to do in terms of multimodal literacy learning is to rebalance the cognitive focus in much of our teaching and learning, to think about also how we can bring in the affective, critical, and embodied domains into the classroom a little bit more. So some of you may know about the Bloom's taxonomy, and many of you are very familiar with the ideas of the hierarchy of knowledge, the order of thinking in Bloom's taxonomy. But do you know that when when Benjamin Bloom developed his taxonomy, he was interested not just in the cognitive dimension, but he was also thinking about developing an affective dimension of the taxonomy, as well as a psychomotor or embodied dimension in the taxonomy. But unfortunately, of course, he didn't manage to do it during his time, and of course that was taken up by eventually some other scholars. But nonetheless, there's a need for us to think about how we want to bring in the affective engagement into the classroom, and the 2 ways of doing it really is to first valuing the students' life work in literacy learning and including the students' life text into the literacy classroom. So what do you mean by life work? Now, the life world relates to the everyday lived experience, the immediately surrounding world's subjectively felt identities, and the informal learning experience that our young people have out of school, the things that they are doing out of schools, the interactions they have with their friends, in the canteen, the interactions they have with their friends on social media, the books that they read, the games that they play. And of course, apart from the life work, we have the little aspect, which is the formal learning, what we teach and what we want the students to learn in the classroom. So what we teach in a systematic way, what we want our students to learn as the kind of knowledge that's privileged in the curriculum. And part of encountering is really to think about how we can bring in the kind of text that our young people engage with, and to use that as part of the literacy development of our students. So for instance, there are some studies that I've done with colleagues, thinking about how we can identify the kind of literacies involved in students' digital multimodal composing and digital play. So for instance, we know that young people today like to make YouTube or video productions, and then they upload it on social media, on YouTube, on TikTok. And we wanted to see that whether something like that can be good for learning, whether something like that also require them to demonstrate creativity, critical thinking, and semiotic awareness. And of course, there was a paper that we wrote with regard to that. If you're interested, you can find a little bit more. And then with another colleague, I also look at the video gameplay of young people and how even in the playing of video games, they were able to demonstrate critical thinking, empathy, and multimodal literacy. So many part of the transversal skills that we are interested in. And of course, the question we have as school leaders, as well as literacy educators, is then how can we value and recognize these literacies in students' life worlds? How can we bring in the kind of text that they are experiencing, they're engaging with into our classroom as part of literacy development? And that is in relation to encountering. The second learning process is in relation to exploring, and that focus on that cognitive understanding. So recognizing that multimodal text makes meaning in specific ways. The way images express meanings is very different from the way, of course, words, writing, or speech express meaning. Videos has additional semiotic modes like animation, as well as music that can come into play. And because the multimodal text is in a different form, we want to have a way for the students to be able to think and talk about this text. And the argument that I have been making through my work is really the importance of a pedagogic meta language to allow both teachers and students to describe and discuss the meanings that are made in multimodal text. And in exploring, it's also important for the teacher to guide and model the analysis for the students. So I'm going to give some examples for that. So drawing on Cope and Calante's work, we outline a pedagogic meta language of multimodal meaning making by identifying the forms and functions of meaning as well as the knowledge processes in designing for multimodal literacy learning. If you're interested, you can read up a little bit more on that. But during this presentation, I will give you a snippet of some aspects of the ideas here. So given the diversity and differences in the background of our students, a common pedagogic meta language will serve as a resource for students to be able to describe and discuss multimodal meaning making, raise their semiotic awareness, and through that, as they begin to be more aware, it augments and transforms their resources for meaning making as well. So for instance, when I'm listening to the band and I say, listen to the drum beat, as you begin to listen out for the drum beat, you become a little bit more sensitive to the role that the drum plays in the music composition. The same here, the same goes here, where we get the students to notice how the idea of power or engagement is expressed through a picture. They become a little bit more sensitive to the way the power is expressed. And we are not alone in advocating for the usefulness of a meta language. Unsworth, way back in 2014, talks about how it's important for teachers and students to have a meta language to talk about language, images, and sound, because it gives students and teachers a way to compare text to determine what semiotic choices were made in constructing particular meanings, what alternatives might have been chosen, and the effects of these choices rather than others. In a project that Mary McIntyre and colleagues did in Australia schools, both elementary and secondary, they introduced a set of meta language that was informed by systemic functional theory. And they noticed that, well, the meta language can actually help to structure the students' noticing, offering a fresh view of choices that may have been taken for granted. And it was also turning up in their writing and talking, and it appeared to reshape their ways of thinking about how images and their contribution to higher orders of meaning in multimodal text as well. So what goes into this meta language? Well, of course, different scholars have developed different types of meta languages for different texts and different student profile. In the work that we have done in Singapore, we have a few aspects in which the meta language needs to fulfill. It needs to give them a language to talk about the integral features of the text. So for instance, when you talk about advertisement, are you able to identify, for instance, the call for action, the call and visit information, the main visual display? So some ways to describe the different features of the text. It is to give them a way to describe the ways of interaction that the text have with the reader. So how does it persuade the reader? Does it use authority? Does it use reason or emotions as a way to engage you? It needs to give the teachers and students a way to describe the expression of ideas, how the message is expressed, both at the literal as well as the inferential level. And also the pedagogic meta language needs a way to allow the teachers and students to talk about the interesting interplay of meanings that happen when words and images come together. Do they reinforce one another in co-contextualization, or do they bring about some interplay of meanings that create ambiguity or parody or visual puns that can happen as well? So the meta language should be able to give teachers and students a way to talk and think about multimodal meaning making. And of course, this has been some of the work that I've been focusing on in developing pedagogic meta language for multimodal meaning making across different types of texts. What I want to do today is to share with you one example of the pedagogic meta language that was in my recent work with Bill and Mary, in terms of recognizing the different forms of meaning in multimodal meaning making. So for instance, you have speech, sound, body, object, space, written text. And one of the things to think about in this, when we think about multimodality, is, for instance, the word love, L-O-V-E. Well, how does it sound in speech? Well, I've spoken the term for you, love. But can love be expressed through sound? What kind of sound would express love? What about body? Can our use of positioning and movement and space express the meaning of love? What about an object? Can you use an object, for instance, a diamond ring, to represent love? What about space or image? And of course, written text, we know that the word love can be written out. So thinking about a particular meaning and how it transposes across different forms that we are familiar with. So that is one aspect of the meta language in relation to the forms of meaning. The second aspects relate to the functions of meaning. So thinking about the text itself, and there are a series of questions that we can ask about the text. And these questions are related, of course, to some of you may be familiar with systemic functional theory, the meta functions, and we draw from there. And some of you may be focusing on the 5W1H, very simple frame, to think about the questions that we can start asking with regard to a particular piece of text. And I'm going to illustrate this in my next part. Okay, so essentially, exploring is about giving teachers and students a way to start talking and thinking about multimodal meaning making in the classroom. And then we have evaluating, because after you have given them a language to talk about multimodal meaning making, then you want them to begin to think about the positioning, the ideas, the ideologies that are expressed through this text. And you want our students not just to accept the kind of text that they encounter or they see, but to encourage them to question about this text. And some of this can be done through, of course, collaborative learning amongst one another, so that they're able to build a knowledge, but they're also able to negotiate their understanding of the text with one another and challenge each other's interpretation as well. Now, I don't know about where you come from, but in Singapore, and I'm sure in many parts of the world, there's a lot of interest in fake news and how can we guide our young people so that they're not easily taken in by the kind of ideologies they see all over the internet, for instance. How can we encourage them to begin to recognize that the text offers only one perspective, and there are many possible other alternatives or other perspectives out there as well. So the functions of meaning that I talked about just now can be used as a way to guide the teachers and students to think about the meanings that are made in relation to the functions, and for the students to start discussing with one another the meaning of the text. So I'm going to give you a quick example. So let's evaluate this text. This is a poster that was created by SG United. It was part of the Singapore government effort to support and encourage the citizens during the COVID-19 pandemic. This poster was extracted from the SG United website under the Happiness Initiative. And of course, you can note the semiotic choices. You have words, you have pictures, you have fonts, colors, cartoon emojis. So let's think about the 5 functions of meaning and how they can be used as a way for us to think about and talk about the meanings in this text. So reference, what is this about? Well, it's an encouragement to the whole nation of Singapore in the form of the imperative text, stay strong, right? So you know the exclamation mark, not the exclamation, but the imperative text that's there. There's an image of an emoji that is wearing a mask, is waving a flag, demonstrating his strength by stepping on a coronavirus. And then structure, how does this hang together? There's a coherence of the poster achieved by image and the interpretive text conveying similar meanings, staying strong, right? So the words say stay strong, and of course you have the emoji looking strong by stepping on the virus. There's a repetition of Singapore multimodally realized by the words, the logo, as well as the national colors of red and white. Agency, who and what is doing this? Well, there's a use of cartoon to appeal to young people. It brings across the message in a relatable and friendly manner. And of course, when you ask the question of who is doing this, you also think about, you want to understand more about the people behind the Happiness Initiative who created the posters. What do they want to do? What is this group about? And then context. When or where is this connected? Well, this exhortatory message is expressed in a poster in relation to the current pandemic. Many people talk about the mental health and the stress it has on Singaporeans. And there's a recognition that this is a message that is part of the Singapore government propaganda to foster resilience amongst its people. And then interest, who or why or what is this for? So the students are then encouraged to probe into the motivation for the production of such posters, and also to think about the effectiveness of a poster like this in communicating the message and in representing the initiatives. So what I wanted to do for you is to show you an example of how the 5 functions of meaning can be operationalized as questions for you to talk about in terms of the meanings of the text, to understand the different aspects of the meanings that's made in the text. Of course, at a higher level, at the tertiary level, when we talk about discourse studies or discourse analysis, there's a lot more sophisticated tools that you can use to analyze the meanings that are made in the poster. But if you are talking to primary school students and secondary school students, and you want an accessible way for them to start thinking and talking about the multimodal meanings made in the text, this could be this could be something as a resource. This could be offered as a resource for them to start doing so. So this is what we have done in Singapore schools. As I mentioned, providing teachers and students a language to describe and discuss multimodal text so that they will know where to look for, or where to look and what to look out for, and for them to recognize the kind of features and functions that the text will serve. So in the project that I talked about, we did some pre-post tests with our students to have a sense of how they were able to then learn and apply the meta language that we introduced to them. So you can see that there are some differences in the students' response. We did a pre-test, a similar image was used, and then we had a post-test, and they were able to be more sensitive to the semiotic choices that were made. They were able to use some of the language that we have taught them as well. This is another example of a difference that has been made in pre-post tests. Now, in the last 5 minutes that I have, I'm just going to very quickly bring you to the 4th learning process. And that is the most exciting part, because that is in relation to expressing, where we want to give opportunities for students multimodal composing, multimodal meaning making beyond just language, a language-centered focus. And we want to think about how digital tools can be used to expand potential for meaning making. Now here, I'm just going to give you some examples of the work that has been done with primary school students, as well as my own course with my students that are pre-service teachers, so going to become primary school teachers in future after they graduate from NIE. So this is an example, and again, this is not something that's radically new to many people, but in the language classroom, and this was for primary 5 students, they had a freeze frame activity, and this was of course after they have learned the different meta language, and of course this was a number of series of lessons this was after a number of lessons that have been conducted. So in the freeze frame activity, they were sensitized to how gestures and facial expression were able to show attitude of different characters, use distance to show relations, outsider point of view to illustrate conflict, this was a focus on conflict in a picture book. And then they took a picture of the role play of the freeze frame, and then they unpack the meanings that have been made and the emotions associated with it. And then they created their own story. They drafted their own story because ultimately we want to also recognize that assessment is language-based in nature, and we want to develop not just the multimodal literacy, but think about how it can be integrated with language learning as well. So this was something that they did, Story Mountain, that many of you may be familiar with. This was an activity that I did with my pre-service students, getting them to create a transmedia text, a twist in a well-known fairy tale or classic using comic strip. Now, if you have not heard of the app, Storyboard, that is a free app that you can use to assess and create beautiful looking comic strips. So this is what they did. Okay, you can read, and some of you may see the interesting story where there's a role reversal, right? Where rather than the wolf being the bad person, bad character, they are actually a couple in a relationship. This is the story of the ugly duckling, and again, interesting representation where rather than the outsiders looking at the ugly duckling in a different way, the ugly duckling was really a goose having a poor self-image. So interesting ideas, and represented via comics, visual frames, visual images, and the use of frames. This is another example. Again, these lessons follow a series of lessons where they have already learned about multimodal meaning making. I've taught them meta language. So in this case, I wanted them to represent their identity as a language teacher, right? And again, this time around, we use this app called Grammanger, which is a free app as well. And this is what they did. So the analysis of the students' artifact, and this was another project that we did in another primary school where the students were asked to create their own food review videos or toy review videos. And again, they have been taught the meta language, and this was the result of a series of lessons that we have done. And it was interesting because the analysis of the student artifacts shows signs of learning, reflected an awareness of semiotic choices introduced to them, and also there was a certain level of creativity as well. So in a nutshell, what I hope to do is to give you a sense of how the learning processes can look like in the literacy classroom. Now, there's no formula, of course. These are principles in which you can think about applying. And of course, being very experienced educators yourself, you would know the needs and profiles of the students in the classroom and can adapt these ideas to serve their needs best. So I hope to some extent I've tried to unpack this very complicated looking diagram for you. But what I want to conclude with will be just two key points. The first really is for us as educators to take a step back and think about how we can recognize the different types of learning that our students demonstrate beyond just a focus on the expression of words. Recognizing students' design work as learning can allow the teachers to meet the students where they are by first understanding how they have been using their available resources to make meaning aptly, and then making available to them the resources which society has privileged. It could be language, it could be certain ways of expressing ideas with words in specific knowledge domains. And really, fundamentally, I would say that designing for multimodal literacy learning challenges the flawed assumption that multimodal interpretation and creation belongs to those who are, well, naturally gifted, the digital natives, with the sensitivity to perceive nuances in meaning. What we want to do is really to equip our students with the kind of resource to allow them to think and talk about meaning making. For our teachers to recognize that there are different types of learning that can be valued in the classroom. And in doing so, we are redistributing the semiotic power from the privileging of language to a valuing of other ways of meaning making. And perhaps that can also help us to mediate the invisible inequities that may incidentally accompany the digital age, where we talk about the digital divide earlier on and how we can address the skills gap in the digital divide. Fundamentally, in developing students' multimodal literacy, we give our students the power to design their social futures, and we equip them to be able to engage with the literacy needs, the communicative demands in the digital age. Now, if you're interested in some of the work that I've talked about earlier on, these resources from the project have just been published and they are freely accessible. This was the phase 1 report that was done. This is the phase 2 report that was just published last week. Here is a 90-page report where we talk about the experience we have had with our teachers in co-designing the learning with them. And of course, the lesson packages that we have designed with our teachers, the primary and secondary lesson packages are all available. And of course, we have an assessment package as well to give you some examples of how you can assess for multimodal literacy. Now, I'm sure you don't have time to look at all the QR codes and link, but just go to this report and you'll be able to find what you need there. I have a book that's coming out on designing learning for multimodal literacy that draws on case studies from the project. It will be out in September. If you're interested, you can find out from the link below as well. So thank you very much for your time.
Right. Thank you, Victor, for a very interesting and insightful sharing on the shift to multi-modalities and how we can use the learning processes to guide us in the planning and teaching of multimodal literacy in our English language club lessons. If you have any questions for Victor or for our next speaker, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the Zoom screen. The speakers will respond to the questions at the end of the second speaker's sharing. Our second speaker is Dr. Donna Lim. Dr. Donna Lim is a lecturer with the National Institute of Education, NTU, Singapore. She specializes in primary English language methodology. Her interest area is in developing literacy with a focus on teaching writing. She has considerable teaching experience with young learners and finds it fulfilling to work with fellow educators to enhance English language teaching and learning. Without further ado, I shall hand over to Donna.
Thank you. Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm just going to share my screen. And if you can just let me know, are you able to hear me and see the screen? Okay, great. Thanks so much. Thank you. Okay, then I'll jump into this, learning to write and writing to learn, okay? Okay, so what we're going to cover today, this morning, we're, of course, the two learning stances. So we'll cover the learning to write first and then the writing to learn. Okay, we'd like to understand these two learning stances because it helps us better with the transition in terms of teaching writing to our students. Okay, so the next thing that we want to cover is also the support, how the strategies would change if we were supporting learning to write students and those who are writing to learn. And of course, we'll end off with a little bit of things for us to think about or consider. Okay, but we're going to do this. First of all, we are going to read a story first. Okay, this story is called Grumpy Monkey, and it's by Suzanne Lang and illustrated by Matt Lang. Okay, here we go. One wonderful day, Chimpanzee woke to discover that nothing was right. The sun was too bright, the sky was too blue, and the bananas were too sweet. Jim was confused. What's going on? Maybe you're grumpy, suggested Norman from next door. I'm not grumpy, Jim insisted. On his walk, he met Marabou. Jim's grumpy, Norman told Marabou. Why are you grumpy, Jim? Asked Marabou. It's such a wonderful day. Grumpy? Me? I'm not grumpy, said Jim. But look at how you're standing, Marabou said. It's true, said Norman. You're all hunched. So Jim loosened up. Then he ran into Lima. Jim's grumpy, Norman told Lima. Why are you grumpy, Jim? Asked Lima. It's such a wonderful day. Grumpy? Me? I'm not grumpy, said Jim. Your eyebrows look grumpy, said Lima. It's true, said Norman. They're all bunched up. So Jim raised his brow. Then he tripped over a snake. Oh no, said Norman. That's the last thing you need when you're feeling so grumpy. Grumpy? Me? I'm not grumpy, said Jim. Then why that frown, said Snake. I think it's because he tripped over you, Norman whispered to Snake. So Jim put on a smile. Finally, Jim looked happy, but he didn't feel happy inside. Everyone wanted Jim to enjoy this wonderful day. You should sing with us, said the birds. Jim didn't feel like singing. You should swing with us, said the monkeys. Jim didn't feel like swinging. You should roll with us, said the zebras. Jim didn't feel like rolling. You should stroll with us, said the peacocks. Jim didn't feel like strolling. You should lie in the grass. You should stomp your feet. You should take a bath and make a splash. You should hug someone. You should laugh. You should take a nap. You should eat old meat or some honey. You should jump up and down. You should sit in the sun. You should dance. But Jim didn't feel like any of that. Why are you grumpy, Jim? Asked the others. It's such a wonderful day. I'm not grumpy, shouted Jim as he beat his chest. And he stomped off. Jim felt sorry, a little sorry for shouting at everyone, but mostly sorry for himself. I guess I'm grumpy, Jim sighed. And just as he was starting to feel really sad, he came upon Norman. Norman was slumped. His eyebrows were bunched up and he was frowning. What's the matter? Are you grumpy? Asked Jim. No, I danced with porcupines, said Norman. Are you okay? Asked Jim. It hurts, but I'll probably feel better soon enough, said Norman. Are you still grumpy? Yes, said Jim, but I'll probably feel better soon enough too. For now, I need to be grumpy. It's a wonderful day to be grumpy, said Norman. Jim agreed. And he already felt a little bit better. Okay, so that's the story, Grumpy Monkey. And we return to that in a while's time, okay? But we'll just leave the story for a while. And I just like to start with this, okay? A little poll for us. So if you can just scan the QR code and you just key in the numbers here, okay? You'll be asked for what makes for the most effective writing, which of these attributes, okay? And you can only choose one. So let's do a quick poll here and see very quickly where we stand on this, okay? Okay. Quite unanimous, huh? I'm just letting the numbers run a bit more, okay? Okay, we're quite unanimous here in terms of the top seems to be the text makes sense. So everybody seems to be choosing that over the other three. Okay, and that perfectly is logical, right? Can you imagine official documents that come out? Okay, it has to make sense. If it doesn't, or if it's full of grammatical errors, right, then credibility is lost, and worse, we don't even get the message. So rightly so, I can understand why you're saying this. Okay, but I'm going to ask you to look at this next text. Okay, and if I just return to a little bit earlier on, none of us thought that words spelled correctly would make the writing effective, right? But if we look at this next text, I think you're going to agree with me that it's precisely because of the misspelling or the wrong spelling that makes this text effective, right? That makes this text impactful. So even for ourselves, as educators, as teachers, right, we also can't quite decide on what makes writing effective, right? And that's what makes writing so complex and so daunting, and particularly troublesome in terms of teaching students. In fact, okay, academics note, okay, so even in the academics world, right, we're not even agreed on this, right? The set of skills and knowledge, the processes, and putting it into a curriculum, sequencing it is even more troublesome for us, right? However, okay, in case we just stop here and think, okay, there's nothing to be done, okay, we are also encouraged by the fact that there are certain instructional strategies which seem to have significant impact on student writing. Okay, so these were highlighted, right, in meta-analysis done over writing, teaching writing, research, right? And these were some of the strategies that continue to remain pertinent, that continue to remain significant in terms of student writing. Okay, so we know a little bit about it. We know that some things may work, has a higher probability of working. Okay, but yet we still don't have the full picture, right? So here I'd like to introduce to us this also. Okay, this learning stance that we'd like to put into the picture as well in trying to sequence a curriculum for our students. Okay, and namely, these two stances has to do with learning to write, and the other one is writing to learn. And let me just let you have a read on what academics say they refer to. Okay, I think you can sense a bit of a difference here. Okay, and Panchon gives us some insight into this, right? One is to express, and the other one is to develop expertise. So if we were to put it simply in our lingo, okay, wouldn't you say learning to write is building the foundation for our students, right? The beginning steps, we are acknowledging that these are the beginning steps, and we are helping them to build that foundation. Writing to learn, on the other hand, is a deeper growth. It's gaining mastery, okay? It's gaining more control over your writing, okay? And it's having able to manipulate or control your writing in such a way that it achieves the impact that you would like. Okay? So those are the two different stances that we're going to focus on this morning. And to help us, if you allow me to put this into an analogy for us, okay? Learning to write, if we can imagine that it's a toddler, right? Your young child learning how to walk, okay? Versus writing to learn a child who is maybe in track and field and learning how to sprint, okay? So between these two, I think you already see a marked difference, right? In Singapore, our primary schools cater to 6 levels, right? And typically caters to 7-year-olds to about 12-year-olds. So you can see already these are the formative years, and already there would be a lot of developmental changes along the way. Okay, so in learning to write, we too would like to acknowledge these developmental growths, and in essence, these two big stances that we apply to them in terms of learning. So let me put it back in this analogy. Okay, so remember we said learning to write is like the foundation. Okay, so a toddler who is learning how to walk, okay, what do? Right? We are very near the toddler. We probably will sometimes we'll stretch out our hand, but essentially we give the toddler enough space to be able to explore, okay, enough space to be able to try to stabilize and then try to walk a little bit more. We even give the space for the child to fall, pick himself up again, and then try, right? Okay, so this, the main goal of this is really for the child to get the sense of walking, right? Okay, to just find out what walking is all about. Okay, but for a child, say in track and field, right, and learning how to sprint, right? Okay, we already deem this child as being stable. Already the foundation is built. This child, the prerequisite is already that the child is able to walk. Okay, and therefore now the next step is to run, and not just run, but the child wants to be able to sprint. Okay, so you probably will hear the trainer, or you probably will hear the instructor teach the child things like, okay, run on the balls of your feet. Okay, you must do it in this timing, etc., right? But it's very unlikely that you would do it for the toddler. Would you tell the toddler, okay, now walk from point A to point B and only take 3 steps, only take 3 steps? Do you do that? Okay, do you tell the child, okay, now use your right leg. Okay, now put down your right leg and then use your left leg. It's not quite like that, right? We withhold technical language and we allow the child to explore more to get that sense, right? Before, later on, when the child wants to master that movement, right? That's when we put in the technical terms and we go further and in depth. Okay, so that's the analogy that I hope we can keep in mind, okay, as we move through. And I'm just putting this back in Manchon's words, right? So really learning to write is a lot of expression, a lot of exploring, a lot of learning what writing can do, okay? And in writing to learn, this is where they exercise control, this is where they go for mastery, okay? This is where the learning is deeper, okay, and more in depth. Okay, so now, imagine in class, this is quite a common topic, right? For us in terms of teaching writing, right? This topic is quite common enough for primary school students to work on, right? Okay, but if you think about it, if I just threw this topic to you cold, not just to you, but to the students cold, right? If you hit cold by it, right? You would be thinking, oh my goodness, what am I going to write about, right? I'm going to have to start thinking about, okay, what's my content going to be? What's this unhappy moment, right? I'm going to have to think about, okay, what words can I use to express this? And then, oh, how am I going to put it into sentence? How am I going to structure it? How many paragraphs? What's the whole text going to look like? Okay, and what do I situate this in? Is it going to be a diary account, a personal response, an article, etc., etc.? Okay, so if this topic just comes to you cold, it's going to be very, very daunting. So can you imagine for the child, it's even worse, right? If in the beginning years, learning to write, it's spelling, right? Handwriting all comes into the picture. Cognitively, it is very, very challenging, right? For the child. So here, I would like to introduce this idea on mentor text. I particularly like this idea, mentor text, and I'll just let you have a quick read here, what it's about. Okay, and I'd like to highlight this, read with a writer's eye, okay, and that's the power of mentor text as well, okay, and I like this notion, and I like this notion very much, a readerly writer and a writerly reader, okay, and the more of it is dealt with, okay, and expanded in this article, Bridging the Reading Writing Gap in Second Language Learning, okay, so this by Dr. Willie, right? And he has made it so convenient for us because, and that's why Dr. Jason Low was telling us to subscribe, right, to Willie's Facebook, because it will lead us also into his blog, his other site, okay, the ELT Corner, okay, and he has made it an ebook accessible for us, okay, so we're able to download this to understand a little bit more about the reading writing, okay, and academics continue to talk about this connection and how powerful it is, okay, when we are using it one for the other, okay. So I like to think of mentor text in that way. So we're using mentor text, we are building the reading and writing connection for students, okay. So let's take a look at the first stance first, using this mentor text, okay. And remembering too, right, that for learning to write, we're talking about the foundation, we're talking about their first forays into writing, okay. In Singapore, and I think internationally, this is quite a renowned and recognized approach, learning experience approach. Okay, but in Singapore, we do slightly of a modification for this, which I will say a little bit about it later. But essentially, for MLEA, we use it as an approach in teaching writing. It's to provide that experience, and this is important for us. Okay, and then with this in mind for the students. Okay, so I'll let you have a quick read here. Okay, the whole idea about giving children the essence of what writing can do, what writing achieves. Okay, so if we come back to this, remember this topic. Okay, and imagine now if we were to use put it in the context of MLEA. Okay, so we want to tap on this reading writing connection. We want to offer the students an experience. Okay, and remember, these were the things that we would have racked our brains over in trying to write. So what we're trying to do is use a mentor text in that sense, okay, provide that reading experience for the students, and then support it in terms of these areas so that the writing is able to come about. Okay, so let me give you a little bit more details. Okay, so imagine Grumpy Monkey, and we just read it this morning, right? So imagine instead of throwing the topic to the students cold, okay, so just before we even visit that topic, we get the students, or we read to the students this book. Okay, and we have our discussion, we talk about this book, what we like about it, what we learned from it, etc., etc. Okay, so we do this first. And then using this as the experience, ELL-NIE, right? So that this reading experience, okay, we use it now to support them in describing that unhappy moment. Okay, how do we do it? Okay, in the context of ELL-NIE, usually we'll start off with the class dictated text. Okay, and here we have the teacher scribing. This is learning to write stance. Okay, here we have the teacher scribing, and we have the students offering, contributing, not just one. This one just happens to be his turn, right? Okay, so they will take turns, etc., to contribute to this class dictated text, but the scribing is done by the teacher to relieve that cognitive load. Remember, the students have to think about so many other areas already. Okay, so the teacher will scribe it for them. But this is the difference in ELL-NIE. In Singapore, we do a modified version, okay, where as far as possible, we elicit from the students. Okay, it's what they want to say. But at the same time, okay, and this is more in the context of second language learning as well, okay, which is more effective for second language learning, okay, the teacher also has some target content, vocabulary, some target items that he or she will build into this writing lesson for the students to be able to practice using. And so in the crafting of this text, the teacher will also have this part in negotiating with the students in order to get at the target content, any items that they're gearing for. Okay, so the writing task, I'll let you have a quick read here, and you tell me, just from reading the book, is there a high chance that we would be able to work this out with the students? Okay, so we can just very quickly read that. Okay, if you notice, right, this is the vocabulary, right? Similar vocabulary that's being pulled from the book and sentence structures as well. So if we offer students that reading experience, right, of the book, and later on when we write it with them, okay, that book can act like a mentor text for them. Okay, so we can remind them of the experience, and if they should run out of ideas, etc. Hey, you know, remember we read about this, but how do they talk about? Do you think we can use it in our writing as well, in our class dictated text as well? Okay, so instead of the child coming from zero schema, right, the child now has some schema, and this schema is shared, right, with the entire class in order to generate and produce a piece of class writing. Okay, so the chances of putting it together, okay, it would be a lot higher, and the teacher would be able to hit at them being able to practice, right, some of the language structures, the vocabulary, etc. Okay, so that's for learning to write, right, the reading experience, using it as a mentor text and feeding it into the writing later on. Okay, we shift over to writing to learn, and here we're talking about mastery. Okay, we're talking about deep growth, and I'm going to use back this topic, and we can see this topic, right, being offered also to upper primary or the older children, right? Can we still use a mentor text? Can I still use this? Okay, I most definitely can, right? Because a mentor text is meant to be able to allow them to be able to read with the writerly's eye, remember? Okay, be able to offer them some learning and support. So imagine if this time in this writing, I'm going to focus the lesson on the organization trait. Organization trait, I'm taking it from the 6+ trait, okay, 6+1 trait. Some of us might be familiar with it, okay? And in particular, the teacher might want to focus on this. Okay, so in essence, what the teacher is trying to do is get them to do a start that is grabbing, right? Creating a lead paragraph for the text. Can I use back this grumpy monkey. Okay, if we just take a look at the start of it, I'm just going to put it up here for us so it's clearer. Okay, the teacher can now take them through looking at how the author does it for Grumpy Monkey. Okay, bearing in mind that these are authentic texts as well, selling out there in the market, right? Okay, so the teacher can first get them to look at the text and note, hey, do you notice the use of contrast here? Okay, and the children probably will be able to point this out, right? It was wonderful, but nothing was right. Okay, so that already, the paragraph is already using certain ways in order to bring about a certain effect in the writing, right? Then the teacher could also get them to notice, there's a bit of exaggeration working here, right? And in narratives, we tend to dramatize when we're telling stories. Why? Because the purpose is to entertain your readers. So exaggeration is working here. Are you able to identify it? So the students probably can bring in these aspects as well. And yeah, these are the ones, yeah, it's exaggerated forms, right? And is there an element of suspense even in this beginning paragraph? Okay, already the readers are cued to the fact that nothing was right at the very start, at the beginning of the narrative. Okay, so the teacher can show them that these are not just words. Okay, these are not just words, but the author is playing around with the use of structures, with the use of content, with words, organizing and putting it together in order to create a certain effect. Okay, create a lead paragraph that would draw readers in. Okay, so this could be analyzed with the children and having the children to point all these out, noticing. Okay, and then later on, you can probably imagine the teacher asking the children to, okay, now in your writing, let's have you try using contrast, exaggeration, suspense, probably in your beginning paragraphs. Okay, in your lead paragraphs. However, would you do a lesson like that if the children were in a learning to write stance? Okay, so here I'm going to let you do a bit of a comparison. So I've talked you through two writing lessons, right? One specifically supporting the learning to write, and the other supporting the writing to learn. Okay, supporting the writing to learn stance. And I'll just give you a bit of a time to think about, were there differences in the treatment of looking at the mentor text, for example, the treatment of how writing was addressed or worked on in terms of the two. Okay, here I'd like to get us to remember this in terms of the toddler learning to write. Okay, for learning to write, it's very much the foundational steps. Okay, and for writing to learn, it's very much the mastery steps. Okay, so just imagine, just apply it now back to teaching writing. Okay, would you use the same strokes? And I'm going to offer you a bit of help here in these three items, right? Were they the same for both of these lessons that we're talking about? Okay. Sorry, yeah. Yeah, so if you're the type that needs to write it out, etc., yeah, you can just plonk your ideas on the chat, and then we'll come back to this and talk about it a little bit more. Okay. You probably may have some ideas here, right, in terms of these three items. Okay, and I think you would be able to sense that the macro goal in writing for these two probably a little bit different. In learning to write stance, remember we're talking about children who are beginning their first few forays into writing, right? So you tend to see the teachers focusing more in terms of the macro goal of writing, right? So from the mentor text, what does the teacher do? It draws out, right, the content. We borrow very heavily the language, the vocab, the language structures, etc., in order to create a text of our own. Okay, so the macro goal here is it's more the in writing is more putting it together in a narrative, and because the narrative is meant to entertain, yeah. So how do we put it? Okay, as a class, how do we work on it to write a story like that? Okay, in terms of technical terms, did you notice that the use of technical terms? If I can just go back to this slide, the use of sorry, I can just do this. The technical terms, right? They tend to be introduced more at the writing to learn. Okay, at the writing to learn rather than at this. Because imagine if I were to use, and these are learning to write. So think 7, 8-year-olds, and you're telling them about, okay, we need to add in the contrast now. We need to put a contrast. Okay, we need to exaggerate, etc. Okay, these terms may totally be missed by them altogether. And in fact, we already talked about how cognitively heavy it is for them already, right? With spelling and writing, now generating content, coming up with vocab, language items, it can completely throw them off if we were to also push for technical terms. However, for writing to learn, because the base is already built, right? They can walk, right? And if they want to sprint, we can teach them things like, okay, run on the balls of your feet, right? But we won't tell the toddler who is walking to walk on the balls of your feet. We won't do that, right? Because it completely misses the child by, right? Okay, so you'll see that technical terms are introduced later so that we can refine their learning and we can go more in depth. Okay, that's when we start naming the learning. Okay, the use of mentor text is also very different. How we draw from the mentor text, the author's craft, the style, the techniques, right, are pulled out and analyzed with the children. But we don't quite do it for learning to write. We let them enjoy the story and we let them pull surface meaning, etc. Okay, and catch it implicitly if they can, the writing styles at this point, right? We allow them to explore at this stage. Okay, so it gives them a sense of what writing is about. Okay, so these two stanzas, and also with this, one of the considerations that we also would like to think about is this tendency. Okay, we tend to see that writing to learn, what we have described earlier on, we tend to see this being stretched, introduced earlier and earlier. Okay, and we tend to, one visible example would be we hear a lot of teachers turning it into using a lot of technical terms with the students. Okay, now we must use adverbs and verbs because we're writing a narrative. Okay, now we must use past tense because we're writing a recount, etc., etc. Okay, so we start to push down rules on these students for learning to write, and in other words, what we're doing is stretching the writing to learn stance, okay, earlier and earlier, which also means that learning to write shrinks. But we just talked about learning to write, right? Learning to write is building the foundation. In other words, right, we are pushing the learning so much forward, we are shrinking the base for building the foundation. Okay, what's the result? What's the result? Possible. Okay, where the base is not built strong, one tiny shake of it can cause the entire structure, can cause the entire concept of writing, etc., to collapse. Okay, and that's why, and that may be one very big area about why we talk about or we lament that children, how come when they're older they still can't quite get a sense of narratives or can't get a sense of recount, etc., etc. Why is their writing still so bad? Okay, so could it be that one of the reasons could be because of this, right? And just to seal it in a little bit, I'm just going to leave us with this study, which dealt on this topic. Okay, this was done by UCL, so in UK context, done on 6 to 7-year-olds. Okay, and with 70 year 2 teachers, 70 primary schools. Okay, so elementary, and 1,736 pupils. Okay, and what was their finding? Okay, this is for narrative writing, in the context of narrative writing, and the findings were that it did not have a significant impact, okay, in terms of the writing. And they also followed up with this. in particular, I'd like to highlight this and leave you with this. Could they be suggesting that? Okay. Thank you. Okay, I'll hand it back to Dr. Jason Low. I'll just stop the screen share here.
Thanks very much, Dr. Donna Lim, for that very interesting presentation, learning to write, writing to learn. And thanks very much, Victor, as well, for your presentation earlier on the thinking and the strategies for teaching multimodal literacy in our classroom. So thanks so much for that.